Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Jem McMurtry, who was a French immersion teacher in British Columbia, that's up in Canada, and back in 2021, in the midst of a moral panic about the residential schools and potential harm that had been done to Indigenous children, up to and including murder, and in the midst of the Canadian government, from the top all the way down to the schools, embracing one narrative, he offered another point of view and was summarily taken out of class. And just recently, after a couple of years in total bureaucratic limbo, was fired. In this conversation, we speak about his experience, about Canada in general, and the culture of utmost politeness that is very slowly, gradually becoming more and more Orwellian. Without further ado, here is Jem McMurtry.
I didn't think it was in my interest to make a splash anywhere. I didn't want to lose my job, but that happened last Tuesday.
It did. So officially canned, I guess.
Well, I'm not just canned because I'm 64 years of age. Then it means that if I go to arbitration, and I have to do that before going to court, then I have to probably wait a year or two before that sees itself to conclusion. And then I'm going to be in my late 60s before this resolves. So it began when it just turned 60. So I really had hoped to have a lot of years of teaching in my 60s, but that's not going to happen. And it really comes down to one thing, which is, being off the woke script, the genocide narrative that our government's pushing everywhere by saying that residential school children who died tragically did so mostly from disease.
And not as some sort of program of eugenics or genocide.
Thank you. Well, that's what it is. And on October 27th, all members of Parliament, including Conservative members, everybody, agreed with a motion by NDP member Leah Gazan that residential schools were a genocide. And then that same woman, that same member wants to, and this was last week in the news, wants to make anybody like me who has a different perspective guilty of hate crime.
Oh, hate?
Yes.
Why are you so filled with hate? Why can't you just let these politicians set the agenda?
But I've been called a denier. And that's one of the things that upsets me, is that what happened with our Indigenous peoples, and some of it obviously was very sad, but much was to be proud of. Comparing, the Americans had 100 massacres, and we didn't have any. I thought the British influence in Canada was much better than the American influence in relations. And so I think it's wrong to call it a genocide, and I think it's wrong to compare it to what took place in Rwanda, in Armenia, and all sorts of places, particularly in Europe and through the Holocaust. I think it's just a really false comparison. Yet I'm being called a denier.
Yeah. Well, so can you walk us through the history of Canada Indigenous relations, European Indigenous relations in Canada? Maybe compare and contrast that to how America or the United States set up our empire here.
Well, I have to be very careful here. I have to admit that I would have a Canadian bias, and I can only speak through through knowledge that's been acquired in Canada. So I apologize to any of my American friends if I say something wrong. But my understanding is that there were many battles between the U.S. cavalry and settlers and so forth. But there was very little of that in Canada, and there was no marked event. And if there was anything that came close to battles, it was more our people in the western part of Canada who were part French, because the first Canadians were French, and they moved west, and over time now they're called largely the Métis, and so they were a mixed group, and then it was over losing land, but it was more upsetting to the Métis, I think, than to nomadic Indigenous peoples who there was so much land. But what happened, in the in the 1880s, in particular, as you know, stories of Buffalo Bill Cody and so forth, is the buffalo decreased dramatically in numbers. So it was a very sorry state that native groupings found themselves in, particularly in the West, because they relied so heavily on that large nomadic species. And it just didn't work well with people who were settlers and had farms and so forth. And so anyhow, inconsistent. So the buffalo lost out, and Native people became quite impoverished. And the Canadian government tried to do something, and part of its solution was to give the kids an education. And although there were certainly cases of abuse and the schools were imperfect, what Canada's done right now is it's wanted to make it into a story of genocide. Now, why would our prime minister want to make it a story of genocide? And only, that's the question that's begotten. And if I could just answer that quickly, and I think it's just part of the woke social justice, virtual signaler's strategy, which is you look a little bit better than everybody that's come before you by saying, well, look, you were so terribly treated, group X, Y, and Z. I'm going to make it better for you, and vote for me, or promote me.
Yeah. Well, there's the virtue, and then the political gains that you're saying, but also we can't ignore the empowerment of government. If they can control your speech, control the narrative, and then extend the civil rights regime to make it even more broad and to, use more discretionary funding as they see fit, and then pad the pockets of the DEI or the Canadian equivalent. Probably there's a French word, equity, inclusion.
En français.
Yeah. There's that whole encroachment of the expansion of the bureaucratic state through the DEI regime.
Well, you're more articulate than I, but that's certainly it. And there's lots of dimensions to my case, and which is why it's gotten a lot of attention in various places. And then obviously it's moved into the U.S. a little bit, which is in certain circles. So I'm delighted by that. But the intention is never to draw any notice toward me. It's simply to say we got a really big problem, and I think it came to the fore in Canada when there was a truckers' convoy, which you're probably very much aware of. And I'd never seen anything like it in my life. Where I live in a fairly, insignificant little town near Vancouver, I'd never seen so many people out in the street with flags and getting in their cars. And it was, there's nothing to compare. Winning at the 2010 Olympics, a gold medal in hockey was far less celebrated than this. It really touched a lot of Canadians because there was so much overreach by our government. And our prime minister, Justin Trudeau, his way of dealing with the truckers' protest was to never meet with the truckers, never met with them, to eventually bring in the Emergencies Act to suspend people's civil rights, but also to label them in all sorts of terrible ways as Nazis and misogynists and just racist and the usual litany of curses in modern day wokeism. But so I think I'm sort of touching a lot of things by. A lot of sensitive chords by simply being a teacher who was wanting to get history right. I think there are a lot of people fed up with our governments, telling us how to think, compelling us to do things that we never imagined would be possible. And I'm currently watching, and I'm a very big supporter of what the Ukrainian people, and I hope they win, against the Russians. And of course, the American government's done a remarkable job of supporting them. But that's what we're against. We're against people in Putin's Russia being put in jail for 15 years, as much as 15 years for doing anything to in any way indicate disapproval of the war. And I don't understand why in Canada, the sensitivity over certain things, whether it was the truckers' protest. And the truckers were just nice, normal people wanting to be able to go back and forth across the border without, necessary regulations. And so they had reason to be fed up. But we've got, sort of the clown prince of, left politics. I'm left politics. I'm kind of a leftist myself when it comes to workers' rights and making sure everybody, has a a livable wage and so forth. But I have no time for political correctness as a teacher when it means that all the good novels that I read when I was a kid are all banned now. Kill a Mockingbird and Huckleberry Finn and Hatcher and the Ryan could go on. And then as well, you've got kids are afraid to speak because they're going to be called anti this, anti that, anti trans or Islamophobic or it doesn't whatever whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's not just teachers that are endangered species, open-minded liberal teachers, but
Yeah.
but kids.
So, one problem that I foresee with your country is going to be interesting because it doesn't seem like Trudeau's going to stop, and it doesn't seem. I just don't see how the Canadians, who are renowned for their politeness, take up arms or do any sort of actual. I guess you guys did do that demonstration. But even then, from what I heard, it was a big street party, which is wonderful. It was, from what I've heard and from what I've seen of the trucker protest, it was a celebration of freedom. It was not an assault at all. And so how does one move Canada away from this woke direction? And especially because woke is particularly designed, either by accident or by intention, to infect politeness, to it's political correctness on steroids, and that goes through politeness, deference, and that liberal, openness is all being weaponized or used to its advantage. So how does one resist that? And people like you telling your stories is one step, but how does it play out?
Yeah. Well, I don't know how good my answer is going to be. That's a tough one. But I just two quick things there. During the protests, which truckers from across the country during the coldest, month of the year, in January arrived, and there were not only what you're saying, happy and party, a lot of happy people and parties and so forth, but there were people that were offering money. I remember one trucker saying people were offering him money to support him doing that, and he was turning it down. He said, "I have more than enough money. That's not, he was having to turn down the money he was given. There was such an outpouring. And there was also Bouncy Castle because some of the truckers brought children with them. It was just so, there was no threat to anyone and anything, and yet that's how it was treated. So I think the answer is, I love that, Margaret Mead, a lot of people believe a small group of committed citizens can't change the world, and yet that's all that ever has. And I'm a committed citizen, and you're clearly a committed citizen, and I think opportunities like this is need to happen and happen more frequently, where people that are frontline, whether it's during COVID, what the nurses were dealing with, or and where truckers are dealing with. But right now, what teachers are dealing with all across the Western world. There was a teacher who was beheaded, Samuel Paty, 2 years ago in Paris, France, because he said he showed cartoons with a senior group of students and wanting to talk about the very difficult issue in France of how far do Enlightenment and French revolutionary values go in this age of excessive caution and censorship and I think social engineering of people's thoughts, so nobody gets offended. But I don't think, and you alluded to this earlier, I don't think it's about worrying about people being offended, because people understand they're offended by anything at any time. It's just sort of a nonsensical thing. And I'm offended, of course, by people who are offended, because I cherish very much.
What do you do when you're offended?
Well, I don't cut off anybody's head. I don't fire a teacher who says the historical truth, and I'll mention what that is in a second. Yeah. So what I think needs to be done is, I just think that there needs to be a movement, and sort of an interesting thing. To some extent, a lot of Canadians were attracted to Donald Trump because he was against political correctness, and a lot of Canadians are sort of typically, you say we're polite, but a lot of us are kind of left of center, but we were attracted to that part of Trump, and we know that Biden's a better person and all that kind of stuff. And Trudeau's, well, okay, I'll leave that alone. But he comes across as a nicer person, and to Canadians, this is just our perception. Of course, that's
I can see
it's forged by the media, and our media, like the CBC and so forth, is very biased toward Democrat or liberal or left-leaning parties. But our prime minister is a nice guy. There's no, he just doesn't commit crimes. He's really goes out of his way to be nice to people.
Okay.
And
Well,
but
not so much
personal
to
level, I
people
don't
who
just
disagree with them.
but yes. So I'm going to get to that. But I think he's a deep person. I think he's just deluded in his thoughts. I think he's just not fit for the job. And I'm a teacher, so I don't want to knock other teachers. But he was a drama teacher, and he's very good at histrionics. But he has no understanding of the implications, ramifications of his policies, and that affects my situation. So at one point, I'd love to tell you what exactly happened to me.
Yeah, go for it.
Should I do it now?
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
Oh, you're such a nice person. And so again, I'm just a teacher in
Where did
British
you
Columbia.
teach?
I teach this time. I was teaching history and French, a French immersion history teacher, with grade 12 students. And one day I was in a school, and at this time I'd moved away from my regular job because I was questioning the woke indoctrination program. So I worried my principal was going to be really hard on me, and I thought that because I'm a senior teacher and they needed people like me to go to be substitute teachers, so I said I'll do it as a full-time gig. And one day after the news broke, including in the United States, about 215 children were murdered because they're found in a mass grave. And there are stories that were associated with them being incinerated and hanged and forced to bury classmates late at night. There was all sorts of things on the story that's still on the New York Times website. Instead, you go back to late May 2021. So this story in Kamloops, British Columbia, not far from where I live and teach, really made the rounds. The whole world was talking about it for a time, but it became a very big thing in Canada because the agenda politically is to show how bad white governmental figures were in the past, and Europeans and all that kind of stuff. I said there's a racial dimension to it, but I think it's broader than the race. I think it's just generally speaking the easiest way to raise yourself up, which is what our prime minister and a lot of woke activists are doing, is to put everybody else down. So it's just basic psychology, and so I was in class, and they. I was supposed to talk about this. I was teaching at the time senior calculus, and they stopped all teachers in the school and in all the schools, really right across Canada, to talk about what was in the news, which was that they found 215 remains of children in a mass grave. Now, none of that's true. They didn't find anything. They still haven't found anything. The police aren't investigating. No one can go near where these grave sites are. It's just complete made up. It's just one person's imagination. An Indigenous elder said something, and then the media ran with it because it's what they do. Even hearing about it was a very sad case, of course, in the U.S. with the 5 police officers, killing a black suspect. And when it came out that the police officers were all black, it was still called a racist incident. So, race is part of it, but it's just generally, I think, the idea that when a government sets itself up to have a mandate, it works very hard to discredit anybody that in any way, of course, violates or has it represents a little bit of a threat to their power and to their own, puffed up importance. And so I said one thing to kids, and that was that my understanding of, and these residential schools, educational schools designed for Indigenous kids or Native kids or Indian kids, whatever word people use in the United States today, American Indian kids, that I simply said that when they were deaths, they died from disease and they weren't murdered. And about half an hour later, I didn't know, but one of the students had left the classroom during a brief break and talked to a guidance counselor. And some of that went to the principal and then went to the district office and one person after another, right to the superintendent. And they removed me within half an hour of making that statement. Two male vice principals came up and frog marched me out of the school. And that's 2 years ago almost, and I haven't taught since. And so I've been fighting this. And
what, were you questioned? Was there any?
No. Nobody.
Discussion?
This is the thing that's extraordinary about it. Nobody it was just assumed without even talking to do it. So I was suspended for 8 months. and they to this day they fire me, and they still won't say that they were wrong. But in the time, and I have a a PhD from the University of Toronto, and in the area of educational philosophy, so I've covered a lot of school issues, including the education of Indigenous or Native kids, both now and in the past, and not just in Canada, but elsewhere. I've also had the benefit of living in different countries and so forth. And so at my late age in the profession, I see myself as informed. So after being abused for almost a year, I went to, I wrote to them. They never wrote back to me, but I wrote enough letters to my employer to say, look, you got this all wrong. I didn't get this wrong. And I talked to all sorts of professors and independent researchers and so forth to be absolutely sure that I was right. And to this day, they're saying the number keeps inflating, but there's tens of thousands of missing and murdered, Indigenous Native children in Canada. They haven't found a single case of a missing child, a single case of a murdered child in any schools. And, teachers generally don't murder their children. It's not good for one's reputation. And so it's just...
Depends on what you're teaching, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. Well, metaphorically, we murder a lot of kids through our being so boring, I guess at times. But it's just such an illogical thing. But it's understandable because, it's a political ploy for our prime minister to appeal to a certain lobby, and there are lots of people out there who want to see how big and bad this our government is, our Western world is, Europeans are, capitalism is, Christianity. They're all sort of associated. Really, everything that defines us has created us. The American Constitution, our own Constitution in Canada, all these things are being smeared right now. So the people right now running our institutions can look like they're not only saviors, but they're more enlightened than everybody else because nobody else. That's postmodernism, deconstructionism. They're smarter than everybody else because they're the only ones that see racism everywhere and how bad everything is. But they have no solutions. You're going to get rid of capitalism, and you're telling kids that. What do you replace it with?
There are even inconvenient facts when you talk about the murder rate among the Indigenous population and who perpetuates that against the Indigenous population. And you start looking at those numbers, and that's inconvenient. It doesn't necessarily lay all the blame on the white folk. But that said, there is a concept of cultural genocide, and that is an inflated term, but there was a meeting of cultures. And so I'd like to get into the nuance of that. Like, to what extent did the natives lose the West and lose their culture, and the steps that Canada has taken to respect and to kind of walk back perhaps some of the assumptions about the supremacy of Christianity from the European mindset?
Yeah, you're speaking, and you're wanting to achieve a balanced, discussion and presentation of the past, and I really welcome that. And I haven't spoken to that. I've read a lot of books recently, including on the early Spanish conquistadors, and Cortez and Pizarro, and it was genocide. It was genocide 500 years ago. The whole groupings of people were destroyed. And as empires fell, now those empires, whether it was Aztec or Incan or others, Mayan, they themselves were genocidal. The Aztecs conquered, well over 300 other native groupings, and Cortez with his small group of Spanish soldiers wouldn't have been able to defeat the Aztecs without the help from a lot of neighboring tribes who were so angry at the Aztecs. So it's complicated. I think, there's a lot in history that we should all be, very ashamed of, and glad that we live in today's age. But in Canada, it wasn't like it would happen in farther south or even in the United States, because we're a younger country. And we're lucky to be part of the British Empire. And the British Empire, worked right away. And then the French in early Canada treated it was a trading relationship. I think the French in New France did a remarkable job of, and even where I live in British Columbia, the British Columbia became a province in 1858, and the first governor was black, was a black man.
Oh,
Now he's probably part European, but he looked black, and he was black, and he married a full-blooded princess, native princess, and that's our first governor of British Columbia. So there was an effort in Canada. Of course, there's a lot that was terrible. People from all over the world came here and they dispossessed people of their land, but they were still given land. Some of the largest owners of land in Canada obviously are native communities, much like in Nevada, the some of the groups there, like if I'm pronouncing it right, the Hopi or whatever, but they're groups in the United States who have large reserves. So it's not as though they don't have land today. In many cases, they have much more land than most of us would ever imagine having. But it was rough, and I say to my students, it was clearly forced cultural assimilation, forced. The church. They had their mission, which was to get converts. But even the missionaries in Canada, some of them went to their death trying to defend, their Aboriginal followers. They created the first churches and schools, and even the languages, the written language for Native people. That was done by Christian missionaries. So all I'm saying is, in my particular case, if you find or someone says that they were murderers, that we murdered tens of thousands of these children through these schools, all I'm saying as a teacher is, you got to give me some evidence before I'm going to teach that to my students, because these are grade 12 students, and I think I'm doing just a disservice, and I'm committing them to me, moral and propriety, to teach them anything other than what is established by the intellectual community. So I'm not always right. I know that, but I do read and I do confirm what I'm saying. Just one of the things you said was really interesting: the confirmation, bias or the bigotry of low expectations. The more we tell certain groups that we treated them terribly in the past, the more resentment they're going to build toward, Canadian society generally. So I don't think there's anything good about distorting, the evil of anyone in the past. I think it's better to do what you're doing right now, Benjamin. You're asking me to be fair-minded, and I'm trying to be.
is there? Have you in your life been connected with the Indigenous in Canada much? Are they?
That's a really nice question. Yeah, that's really nice. Because the person, my closest friend, is part Indigenous. So I don't think, in Canada, that it's just hard, because we've been in Canada for a long time, as you know. I just quickly say that the first time I'm in Canada was really, early 1600s, Quebec City in 1608. So that's a lot of time of intermarriage.
Yeah.
And cross fertilization between different races. So I don't really know what any of us is, and fully, because we're all a mix. So I would say that that most Canadians have that attitude, that we don't really want to see people on the basis of race or skin color or whatever. We just want to just live well with other people, and there are a lot of Indigenous groupings in Canada who are fabulously wealthy because they have large reserves. You call them reservations. We call them reserves here. And that are, sitting like in the West on, where there's a lot of oil and gas and other resources. So, this idea when people make, these blanket statements, all, schools for, Native kids in Canada's past were, houses of horror, that's just not true. And that's all I want to do as a teacher, and I'll never work again. So what I have to do right now, sorry, you can say something.
You don't think that you'll work again? I mean, there's so many different, maybe not in the system, but there's so many things that you can
But as
do.
a teacher in Canada, I don't know how I'm going to do it, because I've stuck to my guns. I've said what I said to the kids is being described as extremely serious misconduct, and insensitive, inappropriate, inflammatory, and many other words, because I said I went against the genocide narrative. And as I said, being in the interview, every single member of our federal government that sits in Ottawa agreed the residential schools were a genocide. So you go against any of that and you can be crushed. There was a senator who lost her job for saying that, but she did that a few years ago. So it's a little bit, I thought a little bit more right now for dissent, but it's still not. So 2 years ago, almost 2 years, I said that. I've been out ever since. I was fired last week. And I just heard from my union today. I can't go to court until I run through the collective bargaining process. Union members are treated differently in the law, and so I'm given a chance to have my union go to bat for me. And I was just told today that could be as much as 2 years from now. So I'll be 66, and so it will if that happens, it will have been 6 years of being sidelined, being in teacher prison.
Yeah. So your union will go to bat for you.
Well, the sense that I'm getting is yes.
Okay.
And it's not officially decided, but I believe it's yes. And I'm not concerned, because if it doesn't, then I will go against my union, because I have a case that's resonated right across, as I said, Canada, and because people are just horrified that a teacher has walked out of his school and his career. That's kind of Zugman for the literary people. They walked out of school and career for speaking in historical truth. There's all sorts of things. Sorry.
Continue.
Oh, I was just saying, in Canada right now, there's the same sensitivity. We always ape Americans. So when you have something coming into your society, you know that Canadians are going to imitate that. It just might be a little bit later. We're polite people, but we're very dependent on you for, and the Americans for our TV, for our news, for all sorts of things. And but what's happening is, if a teacher, I know people, because I'm fighting to help other teachers, who don't want to use some of these pronouns that are being demanded, which Z and Z. Anyhow, I don't remember them myself. If a teacher refuses to fights against the censorship of literature, if a teacher refuses to call anyhow, just on and on and on, and this the trappings of wokeism, where if it's a Black History Month and you got to wear a black shirt. If it's an Indigenous celebration day, which there are now 4 in Canada, you got to wear an orange shirt. It just goes on and on. If you do go against any of this compelled speech, action, or thought, then you're like in Orwell's 1984. You're a thought criminal. And this, it's, of course, it's evident to you because it's in your universities, it's in your high schools, and yeah.
Well, it goes back to the question of what are the breaks that Canada has, or Canadians have, to put this. But just to finish up the technicalities of your story, so being fired at this age, does that disrupt your retirement funds? Because the way that we're set up in America is if you can retire at a certain age, but if you wait longer, you get more Social Security or whatever.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing is I'm going to be okay, but I would want to teach because I was a private school teacher for a lot of years, and they don't have pension plans and that sort of thing. And so it's really against me financially. I'm not working for a few more years. I'm not working during that time to build up my pension further. So I'll be okay, but I just, I wouldn't have been if it were longer. So how many teachers are not doing what I'm doing, which is standing up? Because it's an abusive relationship. It always is, I guess, and within an institution, because one side has all the power. It can take away the employee's salary. It can say to them, if you speak up, then we're going to double down. We're going to make this worse for you. And that's what's happened to me. And I'm just, every time I speak up or do anything to try and counter, to appeal to them, that what they're doing is wrong, then they just add to the punishment. So now it's got to this absurd escalation of me being a fired teacher for saying an historical truth. Yeah. So the problem for me is if I wanted to work anyway in teaching, public school, private schools, any level, anywhere, what do I say? For the last number of years, I've been threatened and I've been all these things, and now I'm in the news as a fired teacher. Who's going to hire me? So this is a big blow.
Well, totally respecting that, there's still plenty of opportunity because your skills don't just vanish. You just can't take part of the system, right? But there's still hungry minds out there. There's still students out there, and you still have the talent to put knowledge into their head or challenge the knowledge that's already in their head. The field of possibility is limited but only insofar as you can't work through the system. Now, you can work against the system. You can do, you can be a part of groups to try to change the system, which is necessary, absolutely necessary. But that's not necessarily teaching, right? Maybe you could take your experience and do the research and do classes about, how to resist or how to do critical thinking. There's so many different things on the table for you that's possible.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that. And you'd be a great person to come in to speak to students, because that's really the message that you want to do as a teacher. Not everybody's going to get into the right university or into the right job or whatever, but that there's endless possibilities for us to have a life and career and whatever that's meaningful. And so those are really wise, beautiful words, Benjamin. But I'm not really worried about myself. And I'm saying it's kind of fresh, the idea that can no longer teach, because I'm not that kind of person. I won teaching awards. All of a sudden I don't know of any other teacher in the history of Canada who has lost his job over an historical disagreement, particularly when the teachers.
Has anybody outside of the system approached you with documents that tens of thousands of children have been murdered? This
is our government, following what happened in South Africa. But what happened in South Africa, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but you had Mandela. And Mandela, forget his early life, but Mandela rose and as his persona rose. And I think he worked really hard not to create a society that was, war with itself afterwards. And once everybody had the right to vote. Well, Canada decided to use the example of Mandela and have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Yeah, because, we all want to be like South Africa.
Well, that's a fantastic issue because it wasn't a good example. Because what they ended up doing, obviously, is impugning everybody, all sorts of people who contributed, in significant ways to society. Well, that's what they're doing in Canada. They're impugning the Christian churches because they're the ones that ran the schools. So this Truth and Reconciliation Commission examined their role and all that good stuff and gave out, billions and billions. Like it's close to $100 billion is being given over to Indigenous people. And again, our economy is 1/10 the size of yours. So it's really appreciable. And it just goes on and on and on. And it's working for the people who, again, are, running the country and running institutions because they look like they're the more sensitive and caring and empathetic people. When what they're really doing is they're destroying their own institutions. Because they're getting rid of merit and excellence and competition and fair play and judging people on things that don't matter at all. And truth, thank you. So I forgot that. That's the most important at all. So this is the thing that really is upsetting to me is they have this Truth and Reconciliation thing, and of course it's not founded on truth because Indigenous children, the school where the 215 children were said to be murdered. They had a swimming pool. They had school outings. They had sports teams. They had brought teachers from, who weren't well paid, but came from, from Europe, by boat, whatever, wanted to devote themselves to helping out people that were marginalized in the making of the modern world. So to me, the real narrative is completely diametrically opposed to what, them being, like the Holocaust, these death camps. So all I was trying to do as a teacher is gingerly step into this and just say to the kids that there's another side, there's other sides of this.
Yeah. Well, if you were put back in that situation and nobody came and frog walked you, is that what you said? Frog walked you out the door? Like what would be the narrative that you would establish as a counter narrative? Say, okay, let's put these two narratives into a dialectic. So what the official narrative is that these residential schools were meat grinders and were there to indoctrinate and to wash the indigeneity out of the poor, dispossessed, marginalized Indigenous people. What's the other side? There's these loose bands, like just like as a storytelling. There was no Aztec empire up there. So how were the natives dealing with each other? Were they small little clans? Were they at war with each other? Was there like a loose confederation? And then how do we build the counter narrative and how the clash or marriage?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things here. Three things. The first one is if I were to go back in the classroom, almost 2 years ago, how I would approach, I would still have approached it the same way. I don't want kids said to the class, that the police murdered kids and tortured them and left them in the snow to die. And all I did was just want to caution. I don't want to trip up students. To ask about just how and then I'm going to come back to what residential schools really were as my third point. The second thing I just want to address what you mentioned, and again you got a beautiful silver tongue, but what they were like is like in the United States. You had many different groupings, but it kept changing over time. We had a genocide that was in our history books when I was growing up in schools in 1649. There was a large group that because in wars like Seneca and Mohawk and so on, but the Iroquois Confederacy, and then they call themselves a Haudenosaunee, but the Iroquois annihilated another large grouping in Canada, which is called the Huron. So the Iroquois came into Canada. Many of them are still here in Canada, but they weren't historically in Canada. So that was a genuine genocide. The intention was to completely annihilate, and they did. And they took out a lot of Christian missionaries who stood with the Huron to try and defend them. Names like Lallemant and Brébeuf and so forth. So it's this whole genocide thing. But generally, Canada has people in Canada's environment is a little harder than the U.S. I would think. Maybe not in the desert, but with colder weather and large space and harder to grow things and whatever. So I think there were a lot of disparate groupings with disparate languages and not having an easy time. And I think when settlers came here, for some of them it became even harder, and for others it became a lot better because they joined in and they traded and they ended up having lives that were much more comfortable, materialistically advantageous, and so forth. So now they just jump to this. So not really any different than the United States, I don't think. I think with regard to Indigenous people.
One small question. When the land acknowledgements are being given at these official functions, how far back in time do they go? Do they say we're on the Iroquois land who were seceded, or who seceded the Huron land, who seceded like those old, like biblical introductions or kingly introductions where this person is the son of this person is the son of this person, and you go on for about 15 minutes and then you cut it off. Do they go through the history when they do this?
I think land acknowledgements are like most communication to students and to television viewers. They're grossly simplified. So they simply say that in the past, European settlers were monsters, and in the present, we're still committing genocide.
Yeah.
And that in my school where I was teaching, it was every day. Every single day, we're continuing injustices. Again, and of course, that's not true at all, because if Native people don't pay tuition, they get free healthcare, dental, they get free, not only land, they don't pay, they not paying taxes. Imagine how nice that would be for someone who's non-Indigenous to. So this idea that we're persecuting today is the opposite. I think there are all sorts of advantages, that's in the, and we call positive racism or affirmative action. Yeah. So the last thing,
racism,
and so to me, there's so many things to talk about that are really interesting. But just the general picture, Benjamin, about residential schools, you can say that there were some creeps back there, some priests who molested. But the evidence suggests when there was, in the very infrequent cases, there was any physical or sexual abuse, it was done by older students, Native students, against the younger students, because they're the ones that were living in with each other, sleeping in the same room or dormitory. So only a third of all the kids Native kids that ever went to school did so in a residential school. It was mostly in the West and North because they couldn't create day schools. Day schools would have been a lot cheaper because you didn't have to, board the kids. So this idea that we wanted to educate kids and then kill them, is just so absurd. But really what happened is I think people, for the most part, did their best. And I say that because I have 4 relatives, 2 great uncles and 2 great grandfathers who are missionaries. And the idea that I never have received any report and my family would be biased toward them, of course,
Yeah.
that they murdered anyone, that they did anything but give themselves selflessly to others. And I think that's probably true of most Christian teachers in, early North America, like starting with the Jesuits and the Ursulines and others. So this
Yeah, how
idea
did
that
Canada get so kind if you guys were evil from the start? Like, what happened?
well, there you go. But our first prime minister, the guy who made Canada possible, because there were Americans and others that wanted to gobble it up, right? And so Canada had a hard time staying together because we were so spread apart. If you ever get in a car and go from where I live, in Vancouver, and drive to Newfoundland, it's a long drive and a boat ride anyhow. So keep that all together. So there's a guy named Sir John Macdonald, our first prime minister, and he built a railway that went east, all the way east to west. And he did some amazing things. He was great with the French, and he was great. He had a personal relationship with many Indigenous chiefs. Great guy. But people now are saying, oh, he must have been racist too. There's only 2 statues to him in Canada that are left. Both of them are protected by wooden boxes, like the one in Toronto at the Parliament. One of them has not only a protective barrier, but has 24-hour police surveillance. So these cultural barbarians that exist in the United States as well as Canada, because there's all sorts of statues, of course, that are being destroyed in the United States, what they're doing without getting approval from the community, they're going and destroying things. And so Canada's the same way. And after all this news came out about 215 children being murdered in Kamloops near Vancouver in British Columbia, over 60 churches were burned down or vandalized.
Really?
That never made the news. It made the news in Canada, but didn't make international news because it was against Christians. And the most interesting thing about it, the government
Trudeau handled that very well, right?
Yes, because no one was ever arrested.
Yeah, he had
wonderful
things to say, though, right? Like when he treated the burnt Christian churches the same that he would treat a vandalized mosque or synagogue.
Well, but that's what's so extraordinary. If it was one mosque, it would have, he would have done nothing else for a month talking about Canadian Islamophobia, and which he had done. But in this particular case, all these Christian churches, and it was silenced until he spoke. And all he said one time was, he said it was wrong or whatever. And then he said, but I can understand why it's happening. So anyhow, give license to people to vandalize and destroy. And the thing that's most absurd about it is most of these churches were, presumably burned down, logically by Indigenous people. But the young people doing that were burning down churches that had been in reserve in some cases for, 100, 150 years, old wooden buildings that many people in the reserve cherished because they are Christian. Or they just want to cherish it because their ancestors used to sit in those pews. So it was a violation of Indigenous communities and heritage and history.
Yeah, one doesn't even know. If nobody was prosecuted, it probably was the case that was a bunch of ne'er-do-well trust fund Antifa brats that did a lot of the
I don't think so, because many of these were happening was really isolated Indigenous communities. So I really, I will say, when most people would, no question, it was done by young people in the community who've been, on my point, I would agree with Trudeau that one way. I wouldn't say it publicly because you're inviting more vandalism, but I will say, similar to what he said, that if you're a person and you're a far young person reserved being told that your ancestors many of them, had been murdered by their teachers, and Canadian governments covered up, for 100 years, you'd be pretty mad too against the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church, but particularly the Catholic Church, because they ran the majority of the schools.
Okay. So this might be skipping around, but I'm sure it's related. Are you close at all with the Quebecois, the French people of your land, of your country? Are you in connection with them? Because I'm wondering, do they put up with the woke stuff? Are they kind of isolated?
So. That's a really, oh my gosh, that's such a a high level question, because they're proud. Because if they're not proud of themselves, they'll disappear.
Yeah.
And I'm connected because I only speak in French to my grandchildren. So 2 of my 3 children married French Canadians, and so the effort is to have them hold on to the language and culture and so forth. So I'm, as I said in the beginning, I'm a French immersion teacher, So I'm very attracted to that. And the French, what they've done, they've been, they're creating walls around, and they're worried about, English too, not just, the woke. They're worried about English speakers generally because they don't want to lose their language, because it's really a
Yeah.
nationalism built more on, used to be Catholicism and other things and the
Yeah.
race, but now people living in Quebec are of all races and all religions, or many of them are non-religious. So what's the only thing that really ties them together is their language.
Language, yeah.
So it's a little bit, in my view, excessive. Some of the restrictions they're putting on people speaking a language other than French in Quebec. But I
Yeah.
understand it because it's for preservation. But they're proud of themselves. So if you go into Quebec and you say your ancestors were these horrible racists toward Indigenous people, well, you wouldn't say it because you don't know what you'd meet in response. You
Okay.
say that in a big city in English Canada, and you're likely to meet somebody who's sipping a latte and wearing an orange shirt and whatever, maybe blue hair, who says in return, "Well, that's just terrible," and I'm ashamed,
Yeah.
and do everything
Flog
in
me
their
harder,
power
baby.
to
Yeah.
to discredit not only their ancestors, but anyone in the future who wants to judge history for themselves.
Yeah.
If you destroy the historical record, if you don't tell people, in the future, or even now in writing it down, what happened, then they won't have an opportunity to know what happened. I think it's just so unfair to mess with the historical record. I just think it's this is what Orwell wrote about. Those who control the past control the present, and those who control the present control the future. It's a really dangerous ideology, this wokeism, and because it's getting people to rethink their own lived experience. If you're someone like me, an older white straight able-bodied male, whatever, like I
Got all the things.
I used to think that my relatives were nice. They were nice to me when I was a little kid, and now I have to see them as they beat their wives, and I just, no, that's not what I remember.
Yeah. So the I'm gonna say it wrong. Quebecois, the French Canadians, they were basically mostly Catholic then, right? So I mean, probably not anymore, but
All.
yeah. So the very Catholic. So it might be another high level question that you don't have to answer. It's just me thinking out loud. The if you look at the history of wokeness, political correctness, and where it comes from, it's definitely deeply connected to Protestantism and Puritanism. And seeing how this ideology meets with the Catholic mindset, even if people don't believe in a Catholic God or Catholic theology, their culture is still based on Catholic tradition, Catholic values to a certain extent, which are just different than Protestant values. So it'd be interesting to see how wokeness merges or doesn't merge with the Catholic Church or just the Catholic society. And present Pope aside, who seems to be kind of on the woke end of the spectrum, it'd just be interesting to see how Quebec has antibodies or is immune to certain effects of wokeness. Pride is one solid answer to that, but also just maybe there's just a different thinking that doesn't really merge with this puritanical strain of thought.
Yeah, the pronunciation, you're doing a very good job. The Quebecois, the people of Quebec, and generally, and they see themselves as a nation, but obviously, they're people from all over the world. Quebec today. So, speaking for those, pure laine, as they say, the pure wool, French Canadians, and again, they're proud of their past. And it wasn't, in the past, and I misspoke when I said all, but I mean, but in the beginning days, there were certainly Protestants and lots of different people and New France, but they weren't going around saying I'm not not Catholic. Not a good idea, back in time. So it was a Catholic society, and it was a feudal society, and it was many things. But there's things about the French Canadians that are really quite remarkable, and you probably get that sense from Celine Dion and some of the other French Canadians that have made it well. They're proud of their roots. They're proud of their food. They're proud of their dances, their songs, and so many other things. Their literature, on and on. So what to me with the woke thing is yes, they're more immune to it because they're more proud of their society, and people in English Canada, because Trudeau got into power, and one of the first things he said was Canadians don't have any values. There's no such thing as Canadian values. So
Oh,
what he's saying was, I'm the multicultural, I'm going to play to all the immigrants. If Canada's 500,000 immigrants every year, that's a lot of votes, right? It's like the Democrats with people coming across the border. So he's playing to that demographic of immigrant and not fitting in, and that's how the Liberal Party stays in power. And the Conservative Party in Canada, like the Republican, kind of more the old order, and then there's all sorts of other whatever issues associated with both parties, but I'm just trying to break it down to its core there.
Well, so Trudeau basically says that there's no Canadian values, and we're going to prove it by firing and ridiculing and persecuting anybody who doesn't believe in our non-Canadian values.
Well, but okay, you're saying beautiful. It's absolutely ridiculous, because every opportunity he gets, he jumps to do another identity. No, there's all sorts of pictures of him in blackface, all sorts of pictures of him in brown face, and wearing all sorts of garb. And he was criticized roundly about that in the first year or two. So he hasn't done that since. But it's still the drama teacher. It's still the guy that likes to dress up and be noticed and have everybody clapping at him. And it helps him that he's tall and handsome and got a nice voice.
He's got that
famous
Fidel Castro nose going on.
Yeah, and or maybe the son of, but as a lot of Canadians are like to say about him, and who knows, but it's just such a. It's not just my case is something that is, again, it's part of what's happening in Canada. And I'm just this little microcosm, but I've got thousands of people communicating with me on Twitter and various other places because I'm speaking up. So Thank you to them. And thank you to you again to take the time to listen to me, because otherwise it's not a nice time for me sitting at home being fired and never working again. So, I'm saying the job that I love.
What you're doing now is part of that.
But I'm a teacher. I know people have said it to me that maybe I can continue. I will continue to be an activist instead, to try and get back in the classroom. And there's maybe some hope of that. I'll be an old man at the time, but I'm a teacher, and then
people are you barred from schools? Do they shoot you on sight or taser? You guys don't have guns up there. They throw a wiffle ball at you until you go away.
Well, there's all these stereotypes. Canadians probably have just as many guns as Americans, because if you go north, if you come visit Vancouver and you decide to walk directly north of Vancouver, you don't have a gun. You're going to meet wolves, cougars, grizzly bears, not just black bears. So my point is, there's probably more guns in Canada because we have more wilderness relative to, and near us than most Canadian and the most Americans do. So I think a lot of stereotypes are quite wrong. What happens when you're a teacher, you get fired, and then it's as though it's not enough in administrative law. Then because you have a union, your own body looks at you, regulatory body. And it's not something the union has wanted. In many cases, imposed by the government. So if you're fired as a doctor from a hospital, then you have your regulatory body, visit you as well and say, okay, now we're going to deal with you. You lost your job, but now we're going to do it. And that hasn't happened to me yet. Oh. And I'm looking forward to that. But, I'm not going to be what they want me to be, which is conciliatory. I'm going to be, as I continue to be, I'm going to be true to my convictions as a pedagogue, as a teacher, which is tell kids the truth.
You're just in bureaucratic limbo. This happened to Chanel Fall and many other people, actually. She's in Canada. She got kind of booted from her job for liking or disliking or saying something on social media. And then Amy Ham, who's a nursing nurse up in Vancouver's being in this just bureaucratic hell for saying that men are men.
Yeah, and she put up a poster that said that she likes J.K. Rowling. Just a poster.
No, not even it was a heart, like a red heart.
Imagine that. Well, and can I just mention, I've communicated with Amy, and she's supportive of me, and we both have a quiet job as non-paid columnists for a newspaper up here, which, it's a small circulation, but, people have come to us because they're proud of, people that are standing up. And Chanel and I met each other a couple of years ago, not in person, online. And this is you like me saying this, and just on Zoom. And there are about half a dozen of us. And we were teachers that were out of the, really being beat up because we were against the indoctrination. We're against all indoctrination. We don't have any agenda. And she's got a very sad situation with her. And it came down to, she had a private Facebook conversation with some other teachers, and someone took that and just made life difficult for her. And at a time when she's also dealing with illness, so she couldn't take it and teaching. But we've stayed in touch, regularly in touch. We've supported each other. And just today, there's a national newspaper in Canada called the National Post. Just today online, so it'll be in a print version in a day or so. But online today, I just learned before getting your show that there's a big article with a picture of Chanel nationally, for the first time getting national recognition for her advocacy for children against being indoctrinated. And in the article, I'm mentioned, my case is mentioned, and so is Jordan Peterson's, because he's now being the same thing. They're going after him. It's like the Sam Bush trial all over again. You commit any form of heresy in the world that we live in today. And this is what's so strange. It's people that they come across as innocent. Oh, we're for equity and diversity and inclusion and all these things that sound on the surface, but they're crossover words. They don't mean that at all. They mean the complete opposite. But I think it's just as totalitarian as any other ideology, because they crush you. It's like, the heel of the steel boot that Orwell talks about, crushing, your face forever. And I just don't understand it. Well, someone like Chanel had her life turn upside down, or me, or even Jordan Peterson. He's world famous. There's nothing discreditable about him, or he wouldn't be world famous as an intellect who worked at Harvard, and goodness sakes, and now people are wanting to take away his ability to practice.
Yeah. Well, if they didn't want him to be world famous, they should have kept him in the classroom and not touring the world selling theaters.
Can I just piggyback on that? Yeah, totally. Benjamin, my employer, doesn't care about me. They never responded to anything I've written to them. They never met me. It's been 3.5 years. It's, anyhow, and now I'm like, they've never wanted to even have me in a room and talk to me. And it's just so distressing. But the funny thing about it is they're going to rue the day that they didn't, because by getting me fired, all these people are coming to me and making a big deal about me. Yeah. And I'm thinking, this isn't good publicity. I think the best publicity a teacher, anyone can get in this world, is not by paying a lot of money and not by going to some marketing people. It's actually by being good to people. In the educational world, is by being good to students. And you can't be good to students if you take away their teachers that want to have an open discussion, that want to let them come to their own conclusions, their own appraisal of history. So they're up against a crowd that they never imagined. They're up against people who really want in schools what we had, which is you sit around and you debate and you go off thinking for yourself. You critically assess things. Now you if you don't believe in the rights of, there's a teacher in Canada who wears prosthetic breasts down to his waist and with huge erect nipples. Of course, you've seen pictures that are, and they're keeping that person in the classroom, and the employer is defending him.
Think of that.
There's been
how does that make you feel? You get kicked
and
out
they
of
get rid of me. Look at me. I'm not. There's nothing about me that's harmful to kids. All I'm doing is I'm as an informed individual who's read more books and lived longer than the people who are judging me. To say that they're wrong and I'm right. The residential schools weren't death camps.
Yeah. Wow. What a upside down world. So what do you miss about teaching? What was and that's the negative question. I mean, what was it about teaching that was your calling, or what are some aspects of teaching that really spoke to you and spoke through you that you were able to access? What was the value that you brought as a teacher?
Yeah, well, I went into teaching for the wrong reasons. One of the reasons I went into teaching was for the job security.
Oh, job security. Okay.
No, and I went in teaching for the job security, which is rather ironic, anyhow, in light of what's happened to me. But I went in there because I thought it would be, a job that you could do and still raise your children. You don't, you're around, right? And it turns out both my wife and I, who is a teacher and now administrator, that both of us, actually taught our own children and coached. I coached my own son through high school. So there's lots of reasons why you choose a job that aren't romantic or idealized or Don Quixote like. But there is that dimension, and I think it's true for so many teachers, if not almost all or all. And that is. And it's no different from what you're doing. It's just feeling that you want to contribute to society, that you and I can't do it by being a great singer or being a musician or being lots of other things. But what I can do is I always, when I was a young kid, my parents used to say I was the Pied Piper with little kids. I used to always like playing with kids and organizing things. And, I had, 4 younger siblings and all that kind of stuff. So I thought I was just good at it. But once you're in the job, then you realize that if you do things that aren't expected, because you're just in there teaching kids math, and which is great because you want to make the little things in life count. That's one of my jokes. But if you're in a classroom teaching math, it doesn't matter how great you are or how lousy you are. After a while, you're just a math teacher. There's nothing special, but you're not building a relationship with kids. You're teaching long division. But if you go into school and you do little things outside of those parameters, if you talk to kids in the hallway, if you hold doors open, if you don't go to the front of the staff line, the cafeteria line because you're an adult and you get to go to the front, if you stay at the back, if you coach and do theater and just do all these extras, and that's what I did. And I meant relationships. I got an email yesterday from a kid in my first year of teaching 41 years ago telling me, that I, was an influence on him. And you go, that you don't get that in every profession. And not that teaching's better than other professions. It's not. It's like any other grind, but at times it's just so beautiful because you're there and you have an opportunity to make a difference. I know that's so trite and hackneyed to say that.
Well, at least I mean, and to kill a kid every once in a while, right? You got through 40 years without perpetuating genocide? Is that your claim?
It's hilarious. And by the way, we used to say when I was a teacher that we want to touch kids. We don't use that language anymore.
No, we don't use that language anymore. And I need to the audience, when I joked about you getting laid, I didn't mean with the students. I just thought because you'd be a cool guy on campus. I'm getting a teacher degree.
But that's an attraction. But that's an attraction for people. There's a power relationship, and you can be important. And I think, to my case, is somewhat true. That it's part of my character that I'm proud of my learning, and I like teaching. And maybe that's selfish, and maybe that's my own sort of egotistical failings or whatever that I need to be telling other people things that they don't know. So you could read into negatively into me and my psyche. But I think most of us, as in the profession, know that at the end of the day, at the end of a career, we can look back a little bit like the story of a teacher who can say that I my life has mattered. My life has amounted to something, and it's measured in the number of students that I see in the street or write me every once in a while to remind me that I did something of value. Because I think when we die, it's not really he who wins has the most toys. Or I think really in the end, what we look back on is the better side of ourselves.
Yeah. So teaching is an oral profession. It's even in the word profess. You're a professor. You profess. Do you write as well? Have you thought about concretizing your knowledge and your experience into some sort of document, whether it's orally delivered through like a YouTube series or written out about your accumulated wisdom?
Well, I'm being lucky because over the years I have a father who was a politician and chief justice and various things.
Wow.
And so I was encouraged at a young age to do things that not everybody gets a chance to do, getting a PhD, for example. And I have written, over the years in various ways and currently with Amy, as I said a few minutes ago, but I am doing that and people have encouraged me to do more of what you're doing and here in Canada and or maybe just in British Columbia of trying to create my own platform and stuff and maybe something like that would come about. I don't know how suited I am for it. All I can say is that I'm not backing down. I'm somebody who sees that schools aren't what they should be. Taxpayers, if they really were aware of what's happening in schools. You mentioned Muslims, for example. One of the things that a directive that I got, I didn't say anything to anyone because I know how dangerous it would be. But we are supposed to, not eating front of Muslim kids during Ramadan and show great sympathy and all sorts of things after another, and tell other kids not to eat around any Muslim kid who is fasting for a month. But this is me. I'm the person that thinks and says, but I didn't go to my employer to say it. Says, well, why are children fasting for a month? So I just don't want to, I just don't buy into anybody's lies. Children developing I have kids that I was coaching who are going out and fainting, on the soccer pitch and saying, well, what's wrong? Are you okay? Well, I haven't had anything to drink or eat all day. So, that's just me. I have no time for anybody who wants to spin any deceit on me. And that comes to anything. Yeah. And that's so I'm not well suited, I guess, in the bureaucratic school system, but somehow I managed to get this far. But the kids ferreted me out. They ferret me out really quickly, and they love it because they want a teacher that just has open and honest conversations. They don't want people who are just build walls around themselves. And yet, of course, my employer is the complete opposite. They want me to be this, in this little box. Yeah. And I can't. But it's not a failing with kids. And I think parents know about it. And I think parents, the sense I get from parents is if I'm doing something for their children, hats off to you, because that's how they judge me through their child.
Yeah. So are you connected with any groups that are activist in nature? Or are you kind of isolated at this point in time?
Well, I was. So my thing is almost 4 years. For the first year and a half, anyway, I was really crushed. And the time my wife got a cancer diagnosis, and just two of us in a house, our kids have gone. So, it was a dark time. Me being out of work and my wife not being able to work again, and so I went through a rough period, and I tried to reach out for help, and I didn't get it from the union saying, you haven't been punished yet, you're just being given this for suspension forever. Yeah. And I can't talk to students and parents and my colleagues or anybody else, and I didn't. One of the reasons they're firing me was the historical truth and the fact that I spoke up about them getting me at so breaking their the muzzling that they want to do for me. So one of the first persons I met was Chanel Fall, but the very first person, a woman who's not a teacher, she's a mother, concerned about the woke indoctrination. I don't know how I heard about her through a professor that's now fired for teaching freely at Mount Royal University in Calgary, and she said you should talk to this one person. Her name's Catherine Cronus. And her job, she's like this queen, unpaid job. She's just this queen bee of hearing from people and connecting them. Yeah. So she ended up connecting me to some people that really helped me and continue to help me, and through an organization that she established called Lighthouse. And so that's the organization. Now they have different names like Woke Watch Canada and so forth. And it's the most amazing thing how one person can set and she's close to me, she's close to Chanel, she's close to all sorts of teachers all over the land, and she ran for trustee and she didn't get elected. So that's the world we live in, right? I couldn't think of a better person to be trustee in the whole world. So I'm not unconnected, but I'm something else that so I have my friends and they're supportive of me and I'm supportive of them and so forth. But I want to be on my own. And people want to give me money and say you should crowdfund, and I really am not doing that. It's taking a lot right now just to fight my fight,
Yeah.
because horrible things have been said about me. Because once the other side knew they were wrong about, they're wrong about, how they're viewing history. They're trying to get me. I'm a racist. I'm sexualized comments. All sorts of things, and they come and they go, and none of it's true. There's just nothing to it. And in the end, they're coming back to that I was insensitive toward truth and reconciliation, and that I spoke publicly. But in this process, they've just been horrible with me, and then it's just, this is what they do. They present you as it's just it's a pile on. This is what so many people are writing about. This is cancel culture taking Rowan Atkinson saying, these what it is equivalent of a medieval mob out in the street looking for someone to burn. And they'll do all sorts of things. So I think if I win, if I fight my fight to the end and stand my ground, and again, my regulatory body is going to take away my license in all probability, because I'm going to be very strong with them by saying things like, by the way, you know better than anybody else, than any other woke mob, based on how they've treated previous teachers. So I'm just going to go my path, and I'm going to stand by every word and every sentence, every letter, every punctuation mark, even the space in between. I'm standing by everything, and I'm going to win in the end. Somehow I'm going to get my thing. So I don't want to be something, part of something bigger. I don't want to run for a political party. I don't want to. I think my cause is important enough that teachers shouldn't be walked out of school and career for telling kids the truth, whether it's in Putin's Russia or it's in Trudeau's Canada.
Oh, jeez. Who would have thought that Canada would go this direction? So are you going to be documenting this? I guess you'll probably be, now that you have a computer and Zoom, you'll probably be doing more of these, get to hang out with Laura Southern a little bit more. Maybe, maybe Jordan will host you, who knows? But so you don't want financial support, but how do people follow you, or how do people support you? What kind of support do you want?
What I think I have enough support on my own. Okay. Now, it'd be lovely to get more Twitter followers, because then I can reach people.
Yeah. So you want to be a place of information. You want to share your story.
Sure.
Yes.
So yes, and people emailing me and so forth. But I think I don't think that's a weakness for me. I think I've got thousands of Twitter followers already, and having more would make me even more. Make me stronger, of course. So I'd like that. And if you were to put on, and in your podcast, if you were to give permission, if you would put my Twitter feed out and my email and so forth, so I'd like to do that. But I think what I'm hoping for, because I want to be sincere. If I weren't sincere, telling you that I'm an award-winning teacher with a PhD who's done nothing wrong and has had legions of kids who have loved him. And now I can't even work anymore, and there's a teacher shortage in Canada. So I just think that I need to be sincere, and this is why, in answer to your question, I think the very best way to help you is by doing what you're doing now and what a lot of people are doing, and that is to take on the woke indoctrination in schools and elsewhere in our society.
How does one do that?
Well, you're doing it right now. You're giving profile to me. You're giving profile to, you're giving it to Chanel and mentioning her name. And Amy Hammond, the nurse in British Columbia, the only nurse in Canada to ever stand up against this. And there's very few of us, and, we're publicly being, guillotined. So I guess we're getting a little bit of notoriety. But I think, if enough people start listening to the message that the two of us are presenting, that people are going to start walking into principal's office and writing to trustees and writing to school board officials and asking their kids what's happening in school, and getting their kids not to accept, not having an opinion and not being able to speak about things and having to wear this color or that color, and to assume the guilt the collective guilt because of your skin color of people who, whether even if you're a recent immigrant, somehow you have to, have the mantle of all the, the iniquity of human history. It's just so absurd. So I think people need to be active.
Yeah. Break the shackles of shame.
That's beautiful.
Jim, thank you so much for your afternoon and for speaking out. And as you said, I will link links to your Twitter feed and whatever you want in the description. And with all this time on your hands, I know you haven't had a good time, but what's something that brings you joy and pleasure that you engage in that's not involved in all of this hoo-ha?
Oh, there are all sorts of things. And maybe the nicest thing of all is feeling that I'm contributing.
Yeah.
And I know it's connected, but I feel I'm contributing in other ways. As an older person and someone who's had an easy life in many ways, I don't need to go on any more trips or have any more, I don't know, steak or, fine wine. I like feeling that I'm doing something for others. I have grandchildren. I do a lot with them. And I'm nice with other people and the little kids in the street and old people at a rec center. And so that's it. Yeah. Feeling that I'm lucky enough in life that I can help make others lucky. So in other words, they've taken away officially me as a teacher, but I'm still teaching.
Yeah. That's what I've been trying to say. Like you can take the teacher out of the school, but you can't take the teacher out of the teacher. Right.
Thank you.
I'm going to end the recording now. Thank you very much.